Hello and welcome to Storytime. And today starts the amazing adventures of Paul. His name was Saul, and we saw a few weeks ago how Saul became a Christian when he was about to persecute Christians on his way to Damascus. And he had this vision, the bright light came, Jesus spoke to him, and Saul, we're going to call him Paul now, becomes a Christian and wants to tell everybody about Jesus. And so today starts our journey of Paul's amazing missionary journeys. Can you say missionary journeys? Fantastic. So let's put Paul over here, okay? We'll put Paul over here. Now, when Paul became a Christian, they took him to the leaders in Jerusalem to meet them. Some of the other Christian leaders, let's put them here like this, some of them. And do you know what? They did not want to meet Paul to start with. Why? Because they weren't sure whether he really was a Christian or not, or whether he was just trying to get in amongst them in order to persecute them more. But there was a Christian, his name is Barnabas. And I want to tell you a little bit about Barnabas. Can you say Barnabas? Barnabas was one of these people who was a man of integrity. You could trust him. He always did what he said. And he'd been a Christian, and people had looked at his life and they said, you know what? He's somebody that can be trusted and he's a real Christian. And you know, people trusted Barnabas. Barnabas knew that Paul really had become a Christian. And so he came along and he took Paul to the leaders in Jerusalem and he said to them, guys, Paul really is one of us now. You can trust him, kind of like you can trust me. And because they trusted Barnabas and they knew that he was somebody that was reliable, they accepted Paul, and Paul became part of them too. Now, we're going to pretend we're in a different place now. We're now in Syria. Yes, Syria. In a city called Antioch. And Paul and Barnabas were part of that church. And these are the people we'll say, and this is the place in Syria. You would have heard of Syria, one of the places actually where there was a lot of war and fighting and oppression going on. And things have been difficult there for a long, long time. Well, Paul joined a church in Syria. And if you want to follow this in the Bible, we're in Acts chapter 13 and chapter 14. And I want to tell you today a little bit about what happened. Well, the Bible tells us that one day the Christians were all worshipping God together. Paul and Barnabas were amongst them, and they were there in Antioch. And God spoke to them as they were praising and worshipping God. You know, God does that still today. By the Holy Spirit, he spoke to them and he said, set apart Paul and Barnabas because I've got work for them to do. I've got missions for them to go on. And so the people prayed. They fasted for a bit. They laid their hands on Paul and Barnabas and they sent them off on their first missionary journey. So here they go. Here goes Barnabas. And do you know, at that time, Barnabas was probably the one in charge. And he was helping to train, to disciple and to pastor Paul. And we find, when we read about it in the Bible, we read about Barnabas and Saul. Barnabas and Saul. And then after a while it changes and we get Paul and Barnabas. And that's when Paul begins to take more of the lead himself. Well, off they were on their first journey and they took with them John. This is John Mark. And John came and joined them from Jerusalem. He was Barnabas's cousin. And so he joined them and they went and they travelled across to Turkey. But before they got there, they went to Cyprus, the island of Cyprus. And there, Paul began to preach and teach about Jesus. And they met. I think he was probably one of the Roman leaders. Let's put him over here. He was in charge. He was a governor of Cyprus. But there was a man who was possessed with an evil spirit, actually. And he followed Paul and Barnabas and John Mark around. And he used to say things. And in the end, Paul turned to him and said, "Elymas," that was his name, "you are a son of the devil." And he drove that evil out of Elymas. And afterwards, this man here, we don't know his name, but we know that he was a proconsul. He was one of the leaders in charge of that island. When he saw the amazing power of God at work through Paul's work, he became a Christian. And others became a Christian as well. So after that, Paul, with his friends, got on a boat and they travelled throughout Turkey. So off they go. Let's put John Mark over here. Come to the next town, which is this one over here now. So here's Paul. Here's Barnabas with him. They go to the next town. And Paul goes into the Jewish synagogue, which was like the Jewish church where they would worship. And let's put a lady over here as well. And Paul would speak about Jesus. In fact, when they saw Paul and Barnabas and John, they said, "Brothers," because they were Jews. They said, "Brothers, welcome. If you've got a message or a greeting from God, would you tell us?" And so Paul stood up and told them all about Jesus. Many of them were so interested in what Paul had to say that they said, "Would you come back next week and tell us more?" And so the following week, the Bible tells us, the whole town came to listen to Paul and Barnabas as they spoke about Jesus. Many of them became believers. They became Christians at that time. The Bible also tells us that John decided that he wanted to go back home again. And so Paul was a bit disappointed, actually, that John wanted to leave them. But John left them and he went back to Jerusalem. And so it was just Paul and Barnabas. And so do you know what? They stayed with the people and they taught them and they encouraged them. And they went outside in the marketplace and they taught them and they encouraged them. And then Paul said, "We need to go to the next town." So they went to the next town and they did the same there. Then they said, "We need to go to the next town." So they went to the next town. And so let's go to another town. So they went to the next town. Here's Paul and Barnabas. We have to pretend that they're going to the next town. Here's some more people. Here's some more people. Lots more people. So Paul goes, first place he usually went was to the synagogue, the place where the Jews met. Taught them about Jesus. Then outside he would meet people that weren't Jews. Some of those would become Christians. But you know what? There was a group of Jews that started to persecute Paul. And then they started to follow Paul from town to town as he was travelling and telling people and stirring the people up against Paul. But even though some people were against Paul and Barnabas, others became Christians. And so off they went from town to town to town, all across the western part of Turkey. And afterwards, Paul said, "We need to go back now and visit the people who we have just seen." And so Paul and Barnabas turn around. Here they are. Here they go. There's Barnabas. And here's Paul. And do you know what? They travelled back to the same towns and cities. This one, this one, this one, and this one. And do you know what they did? Well, they stayed there for a little while. They taught the new baby Christians how to trust in Jesus. They made some people leaders as well and said to them, "Be strong in the faith and tell more people." And as Paul and Barnabas travelled back through the towns and cities that they'd already gone, so they saw how Christianity was spreading and spreading. And the last thing to happen was they came back to the church where they started. Can you remember where that was? That's right, it was Syria. And when they got back there, they began to tell the people. They gave a report back on all that they had done on their first missionary journey. And the people were excited. They probably cheered. They probably clapped. And they were very, very excited. Even though it was hard. And on at least one occasion, Paul got beaten up badly. And some people thought that he might even die. But Paul got up, flushed himself down. And just like Jesus had said earlier on, he went to the next town and kept telling people about Jesus. So that's today's story. The message of Jesus is spreading fast and wide. And Paul and Barnabas are the ones who start to take it into the world further and wider. Hope to see you next time. Bye.